And the BRICS member states have urged for concerted efforts to fight terrorism in accordance with the international laws. The declaration at the end of the 11th BRICS summit stressed on the need to tackle the misuse of information and communication technologies for terrorist activities and combating illegal financial laws. And speaking at the plenary session of the summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said terrorism has caused a loss of approximately $1 trillion to the world economy and 2.25 lakh people have lost their life due to terror acts in over a decade. For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests in the studio today. Let me first introduce the guest to you, beginning with Retired Major General Dhruv Katoch. He is the Director of India Foundation. We also have with us Mr. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor from Hindustan Times, and former Mr. Ashok Sajjanhar as well here with us. Pramit, let me begin with you, and let's encapsulate as to what exactly has been said and focused on the issue of terrorism in the 11th BRICS summit, which has just come to an end.
Well, as the summit communique mentions, they had a fourth round of the joint working group on counterterrorism in the BRICS. As you mentioned, Prime Minister Modi emphasized this in his own speech before the summit. And the communique also iterated the importance of the Financial Action Task Force, which of course is useful, important to India because it's one of the primary instruments we've been using to contain, if you wish, Pakistan's use of terror against us and other countries. The BRICS is not a coherent body in that it does not have a secretariat and does not enforce a lot of what it says. It has no means to do so. But analyses have shown that there's a roughly 77% compliance by BRICS members of the communiques and statements that they issue. And that itself is useful because if you are Pakistan, and I think ultimately this is what we're really trying to message, that a number of countries that are close to Pakistan, notably in this case China, and in one case, the case of Russia, a country that Pakistan has been wooing very strongly, have signed up, if you wish, for a set of proposals and understandings on terrorism that clearly do not give Pakistan any legitimacy in anything that they do. And so the BRICS is a useful, it should be looked upon as being an add-on to what, or supplement to what we're also doing in the United Nations, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and in various other bodies across the world. So in that way, it's been, I think, useful, at least symbolically, for India. And as I've mentioned, China's compliance with all of this, I think is really important given that country's relationship with Pakistan.
Okay, so quite an important forum to go ahead and raise its point as far as India is concerned, and seems to be taken on board as well. And Mr. Sajjanhar, let me bring you in here, and two aspects, which seems to be the focus areas in the Brasilia Declaration, that's the 11th BRICS Summit. One is the commitment to tackle the misuse of information and communication technologies. And the second one is to ensure that the terror financing, that the FATF issue, something which, Pramit also referred to, should be put in check. And the reference here, seemingly in one of the parts, is to Pakistan, obviously.
Yes, I think we can presume that it is also referred to Pakistan, but I'm sure it's referred to other countries also, because there's no specific reference to Pakistan. There is no reference to cross-border terrorism, which I think if it had occurred, that would have given us considerable satisfaction and happiness. But that notwithstanding, I think the declaration is important, and also some of the other initiatives, including the two that you have mentioned, Vishalji, they are important because, after this fourth meeting of the working group on terror, they decided to set up 5 subgroups. And they will be meeting, and in those 5 subgroups, one of them is terrorist financing, the other is on use of internet for terrorist purposes, the other is for countering radicalization, issue of foreign terrorist fighters, and capacity building. In all these areas, India has great expertise, India has great experience, so we'll be able to take it forward.
Okay.
But coming back to your question in terms of FATF, FATF receives very significant coverage and treatment as far as this declaration is concerned. And let me also say, it's a very comprehensive declaration, and it deals with the issue of terrorism also in a very substantive way. And there it has mentioned that basically the responsibility for curtailing terrorism, taking action against terrorism, lies squarely with the concerned states. So, the states cannot really wash their hands off saying, that these are non-state actors. This is something that is sought to be communicated by this, that it's the primary responsibility of the states to ensure that their territory is protected and that there is no money laundering, there is no use of ICT for criminal purposes or for promoting terrorism.
Okay.
So in that sense, number one, the importance, the responsibility of the states, and number two, that it is the United Nations as an umbrella under which all these activities will take place.
Okay.
But FATF is definitely a very important instrument that we have been using, that different countries have been using in trying to see that those countries which are supporting terrorism, that they stop funding terrorists in whatever way. And I think the fact that all the 5 countries have come onto the same platform to again reiterate the importance and significance of FATF and of ensuring ICT for use against criminal activities and terrorist activities. I think this is very welcome. India should take it forward. Just one rider I will give, that many of these declarations are adopted. For instance, if you go back to the declaration in 2017 at Xiamen, there we had mentioned all the terrorist groups that are operating against India and against Afghanistan from Pakistan. Jaish-e-Mohammed was mentioned, Lashkar-e-Taiba was mentioned, Haqqani group was mentioned, all these groups are mentioned. But really, in terms of effectiveness of these declarations depends on the implementation. Whether the countries, are they hypocritical or will they walk the talk? Okay. I think that will be the proof of the pudding, so to say.
Okay, that's quite apt. Everybody, all those member nations will have to walk the talk. That brings me to General Khatoj. General Khatoj, one, the significance of this declaration, and two, as Mr. Sajjanar has put it, the proof of the pudding is going to be in whether or not the member nations walk the talk.
No, let me get to the significance first. And I think it is a very significant statement, because when you look at the 5 BRICS nations, nearly 50% of the global economy is covered by these 5 nations. And if we are talking at a loss, as the Prime Minister mentioned, of $1 trillion per year, an economic loss, we can say that roughly $500 billion is really being caused to these 5 countries in real terms. Now, for 5 countries who are nearly 50% of the world economy, for all of them to get together and to issue out a declaration in no uncertain terms that this is a problem which we all need to address with, and secondly, to state that it has to be carried out under the UN umbrella. I think both these points are very significant, right? Because we are actually looking at these 5 countries working towards a common purpose under the UN. I think that sends out a very, very strong signal. Now, they've also said in this, you see, that we are not going to associate this with any religion, with any nationality, or with any civilization. Now, if we say that is fair, but everybody knows that when we are looking at terrorism, if a nation is supporting terrorism, it may be a particular government which we have to associate it with, but perhaps you could, in a larger sense, say that, okay, it is not the people of that country who are supporting it. But when we look at the religious angle of it, I think terrorism gets the name for the actors in that stage. So if there is a particular actor who wishes to create a country based on a particular line, then the name of that terrorist will become on that line. So if somebody is seeking independence, let us say when we are looking at the Sri Lankan situation, where we had the Tamils vying for an independent homeland.
Okay.
So obviously, when they want a Tamil homeland, they become Tamil terrorists. So similarly, if people want an Islamic state, then the name will be, and the name obviously comes to Islamic terrorism, which is a word which is being used by most of the Arab nations as of now.
Okay.
So that is one part of it. The second thing I think which is very important is when these 5 countries get together, I think if you operate comprehensively on 2 issues, one is the financial aspects, and secondly is controlling the communication networks. Now, terrorism spreads on these two pillars. 90% of terrorism consists of ideology and finances combined together. Finances spreads due to various means, right? Illegal methods. It could be through drugs. It could be through direct support by certain people who give money for a particular cause. It could be through arms smuggling or various criminal networks. And ideology spreads now, it is not so much by word of mouth, it is really through the web. So when we are looking at it in this particular manner, if these 5 countries can get together and form common action plans to see how terrorism can be controlled from at least on these 2 pillars, and then as a body get the whole world involved.
Okay.
I think then we are moving in a very constructive and forward way. And I would say that to that extent, this has been a very, very positive step, and it is beneficial for India.
Okay. Pramit, on the walking the talk aspect, these 5 nations, and as General Katoj also put, if you look at the economic aspect of it, they are the economic powerhouses of the entire world, and the economic loss per se due to terrorism is also very huge, as the Prime Minister also tend to quantify approximately $1 trillion to the entire world. So from that perspective, do you think that it is now imperative for all these 5 nations to go ahead and do what is required to be done to try and combat this challenge?
Well, keep in mind that each of these countries has a slightly different terrorism problem. Brazil doesn't really have a terrorism problem at all. There's very little terrorism, as we would call it, in Latin America. There's been a little bit of Islamic activity in some areas, but broadly, Brazil has no terrorism concerns.
Rather, their problem is organized crime.
Yes, which doesn't fall under the ambit of the BRICS at all. And even the old left-wing terrorism that used to be a problem in Latin America has now largely died out, except for in Colombia. South Africa also does not have a major terrorism problem. There have been, again, a few small Islamic groups that have been operating there, but nothing major and nothing of a concern. And the biggest African terrorist groups, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and so on, do not operate in Southern Africa. So for South Africa, this is not a major concern. Russia, China, and India are the 3 countries that are genuinely concerned about terrorism in its formats. Russia, of course, the primary focus has been the terrorism that has emanated out of Chechnya and the Caucasus region, and it is one of the key reasons they decided to intervene in the fight in Syria and against the Islamic State, because the biggest foreign component of the Islamic State, or the most effective foreign component of the fighters, came from Chechnya. With the collapse of the Islamic State, it's still an important concern for Russia, but not as big a concern as it was in the past. Now, obviously for India, while the Islamic State is a concern, and the resuscitation of or the sudden arrival of the Islamic State, for example, in the attack in Sri Lanka recently, and evidence of IS modules in southern India. It's an important problem, but it is not, for example, as a bigger problem for us as Lashkar Taiba is, or even for that matter, Al-Qaeda, which Al-Qaeda Islamic State functions in the Bay of Bengal now today, is considered a much more direct threat to us. China's decision to effectively try to eradicate Islam altogether in its culture and its society is probably the most extreme example of any country trying to handle the problem of Islamic terrorism on its soil by simply eradicating the entire culture and society. That's obviously a path that no other country is prepared, definitely not India, to go down. And it's an extreme measure, but it is a problem that is highly specific to China. The Uyghurs are not an issue as far as India or even Russia are concerned. So you have the problem that terrorism in a broad sense is a concern for all the 5 countries. In a general, on a more specific case, it is a real problem, a live problem for 3 of those 5 countries. But each of these 3 have a slightly different perspective and angle to it. So implementation is there, and that's why terrorist financing and online radicalization is an area of convergence.
The misuse of ICT.
Yeah, that is something that affects all of us. And terrorism financing is highly fungible. It is often the same networks can be used by several different terrorist organizations, even though they may have nothing to do with each other. So terrorism financing, these type of cross-border concerns are definitely there. And obviously for China at least, as the ambassador has mentioned, cross-border terrorism is a no-go for them simply because their relationship with Pakistan remains extremely close.
Okay, and Mr. Sajjanhar, if you look at it from this perspective, the kind of threats which some of these member states face are entirely different from what the other states might face, as Pramit is pointing out. But the way these two areas have been identified, that is the terror financing and the misuse of ICT, these are the common elements.
Yes, absolutely. I think whatever are the challenges that these countries will face, I think these are common strands that straddle all these, the manner in which these terrorist organizations are operating. If you permit just a few comments, meaning of course, these 5 countries, they started in 2009, we are having the 11th summit. But these are at the moment, territorially, population-wise, they might represent a very big, huge element proportion. But in terms of GDP and trade, they are still not that significant. If you look at the total GDP, it is just 23% of the world GDP. In terms of world trade, it represents 17% of world trade. In terms of population, it represents about 42 to 43%. So in terms of geographical area and population, it's huge. But in terms of GDP, of course, they are growing. These are the emerging market and dynamic economies. And every year they contribute, whatever is the global GDP growth, these 5 countries are contributing about 50% to that. So in that sense, their significance is increasing. And as Pramit said, I agree with him, except that let me add a couple of more points.
Okay.
As far as Russia is concerned, Chechnya is important, but also they are getting extremely worried as far as Central Asia is concerned, because they are concerned that if the Taliban were to come back into Afghanistan, that is going to create instability in Central Asia, whether it is the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, whether it is Hizb ut-Tahrir or the other groups. And this is the underbelly as far as Russia is concerned. So they are extremely concerned, and that is why they want to, and that is the ostensible reason why Russia has said that it has opened negotiations or talks with the Taliban, so that they will make sure that at least the Islamic State, when it gets defeated in Iraq and Syria, and it comes and establishes bases in Afghanistan, in the eastern part, in Nangarhar province, or even in the foreign fighters, when they are vanquished in Syria, they come back to Central Asian states. Because you would recall that the former president of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, he said that from these 5 states, which just have about 65 million population, there are more than 15,000 young men and women who have been radicalized and who have gone and joined the Islamic State. So for Russia, that is also a problem. And in that sense, it wants to approach the Taliban via Pakistan to have a dialogue with them.
Okay.
As far as China is concerned, again, it is, they treat terrorism on parallel tracks. One is as far as Xinjiang is concerned, as far as Uyghurs is concerned. We know that they have put in prison, put behind, so to say, in concentration camps, more than 1 million Uyghurs. And they say that they are trying to control terrorism. Now, there is no sort of terrorist activities that have been seen, but they have changed the total demography of Xinjiang by replacing the local Uyghur population with the Han population. So that is an action against so-called terrorism that they are taking there. But as far as Pakistan is concerned,
the cross-border terrorism.
Yeah, Pakistan terrorism against India or Pakistan terrorism against Afghanistan, they are very easy with it, as long as they don't affect either the Chinese people who are working on the CPEC corridor or in Balochistan. There have been some attacks against that, and they have taken Pakistan to task for that. So as far as they are concerned, terrorism is on a parallel track. On one, they would like to take very strong action. They do take strong action, notwithstanding what the world is saying. And on the others, they are quite lax about it. So that is why I said, even in 2017, when in Xiamen, in September, we had mentioned all these groups. But immediately 2 days after that, the foreign minister of Pakistan was in China, and China was saying that we need to recognize the huge sacrifices that Pakistan has made in fighting terrorism, and that Pakistan is as much a victim of terrorism as the other countries.
Okay, so in this scenario, Mr. Sajjanhar, what's the way forward? Then how does these 5 states deal with the issue of terror and go by what the promises they've made to themselves in the declaration?
You see, my take on this would be what Pramit had said right in the beginning. This is one forum. We have to take full advantage. We have to take full advantage of all fora, whether it is FATF, whether it is G20, whether it is SCO, whether it is RIC, whether it is the United Nations. Across the board, we have to raise the question of terrorism, and that the world should act together. There should be no double standards, there should be no hypocrisy, there should be no division into good terrorists and bad terrorists. And in that context, this forum is an important forum. It's a significant forum. As you said, Vishal, right at the beginning, 4th meeting of the Working Group on Terror has been formed. There was a special symposium on dealing with terror, on counter-terrorism, that took place, a seminar took place. There have been 5 working subgroups have been formed. So the point here is that this working group on counter-terror was formed only 4 years ago in 2016 when the meeting took place in Goa in October. So over this period, this institution, this organization has made significant progress, has made significant improvement, has added significantly to the fight against terror, and I think this should be used to the fullest extent. That having been said, the other fora also we need to be conscious.
Final words from you specifically. If you look at the way forward from here, keeping in mind all these equations, both between these nations and their own respective outlook of the threat of terror, which these nations have individually.
I think let's understand one thing absolutely fundamentally, which is what my colleagues have also stated in a certain way. Every country has to fight its own battle of terror. So as far as India is concerned, let us be straight, it is our war what we are fighting. Which is why China is fighting its own war. They're not too much concerned, as Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar said, about what is happening with the others, right? So every country will be concerned. But you see, the importance of forum like BRICS is, it sensitizes a very large segment of society. The very fact that Brazil is being sensitized, despite the fact that they do not face these problems, that level of sensitivity goes to the whole of South America. It also transcends to North America. When South Africa is being sensitized, it transcends to other areas also. I think it is important for the whole world to be sensitized, because terrorism is such an act. It may not hit you today, it will most certainly hit you tomorrow. Just take the incidents of what happened on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka. You see, Sri Lanka was least expecting a terror attack by Islamic fundamentalists, and yet it happened. Now the question is, it can happen anyway. So for people to state that, we may not be so much affected and we won't get involved, I think will be short-sighted. So to that extent, when we have a BRICS forum, which as one voice is talking about this particular problem, I think it is important to send a wider message across the world. Secondly, the other forums are more important. You see, I think the most important forum is really the United Nations. And in that, I think the 2 aspects which I had spoken of initially, the FATF and countering means to control the spread of ideology through the internet or through the social media. Specifically. Now, I think those are the ones where you require an approach which is a whole world approach and not a country-specific approach. Because a country by itself cannot really do it. So to that extent, I think when we are looking at the BRICS, it should be looked as when you're looking at a number of chess pieces, This is just one piece in the board.
Okay.
And there are other pieces also which have to be played. And I think India has played it very dexterously. I am absolutely certain if India had not taken up the point of terrorism in BRICS, you would not have had a resolution of this nature coming out.
Fine.
So I personally feel that this is an initiative of the Indian government, specifically of the Indian Prime Minister, which has pushed it through and which now for the last 4 years is carrying the baby, so to say.
Okay, and that's quite an exhaustive, piece on the issue of terrorism in that resolution out there. Final words from you, Pramit, on the way forward from here, given all these complexities involved.
Well, look specifically at financial terrorism, because terrorism finance in many ways, as I've said, is the glue which all of the 5 members can work together on. And it is it is proved the primary international instrument we are now using against Pakistan. Given the weakness of the Pakistani economy, they can face they have no capacity to withstand almost any form of sanctions or additional costs of finance. So what we are doing, though, look at what we're trying to do. Russia and China are also trying to set up a separate structure for interbank payments, so their version of the SWIFT structure. We've joined China in supporting their version of the World Bank, AIIB. So there's an entire parallel financial architecture being created, if you wish, by China with some backing from Russia, which we are to a large extent trying to be a part of. But the good thing about it is that we can use the example of the BRICS or the SCO's statements on counterterrorism to insist that these new structures should incorporate anti-terrorism mandates and rules and regulation. This will then squeeze Pakistan even further. Not only do they also already have to face Western problems, that even if they were trying to use an alternate system by their friend China, they'll find, oh, the rules are already set because India is on the high table at all of these.
Okay, so there it is, as our panelists have pointed out, the detailed analysis of, the BRICS focus, specifically the 11th summit of the BRICS declaration focus on the issue of terror. Now, as our panelists are pointing out, while all these 5 nations might have their own different threats as far as terrorism is concerned, but going the human as well as the economic cost of the threat of terror, not only all these 5 nations, but the entire world seemingly will have to come together and